Welcome to Story Comic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 419. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're honored to have with us the internationally celebrated and award-winning Vermont author, Ann Cardinal.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
All right. And I got to say, for our listeners out there, Ann has an amazing background. She has the most pristine and picturesque author's studio right there behind you.
It's, a lot of my friends they're like, oh, I need to have the walls bare and nothing so it doesn't complicate I'm like, no, I need chaos. I mean, that's how I create. So there's lots of colors and things going on. And that the books there are actually a lamp.
No way. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, and the skulls are necessary.
Yeah. Okay.
Right behind me.
That's right. You get the skulls. You get some bats. This is like the perfect, like young adult author, horror author background that you have going on there. So it's spooky. It's spooky but safe at the same time. See,
it's also my vibe. Even without the author thing, I've been in love with horror most of my life. My adult is not horror; it's magical realism. But I've always loved horror, so I've always had that sort of sensibility.
Okay, and so as we said in the intro, you are a Vermont author. You've been in Vermont for many years, and you have a new book coming out in June.
Yeah, June 17th. You've awoken her.
Okay, and does this also fits under the young adult or the magical realism genre?
That's young adult horror. It's my Cthulhu in the Hamptons book. So, for anybody who doesn't know who Cthulhu is, you actually do. You just didn't know his name, but he's H.P. Lovecraft, who was a famous, very problematic horror writer, New England, and Cthulhu is probably his most famous monster. So it's a sort of a way of taking him back, with a Puerto Rican main character, and yeah, I had a great time writing that one.
Now, as you mentioned, you write adult novels and you also write young adult novels. How is it different between? How is the writing style different between the two?
That's a great question. It is young adult. You have an audience that's impatient, and it really keeps you honest. They're not going to stand for a lot of pontificating, so I like it because it's like you get right to the story or you lose them. And I find that really helpful. I grew up in magical realism. I love the ornate language. But I also, in terms of writing, I used to write ornate and then I'd write myself into a corner. And when I started writing young adult, it pulls in and you distill it down to the story. And I enjoy it. I don't plan on ever stop writing that. I'm writing a lot of adult now, but I love the young adult field.
So walk us through your typical writing process. I'm really curious about that. How do you begin a new project and what steps do you take from, say, like the first concept to the final draft?
Well, I used to be, they say plotter or pantser, because you go by the seat of your pants. And I used to be very much a pantser. And I did the MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts in writing. And I started to realize I would write myself into corners, and I always knew where it started and I had a good idea where it was going to end. And then stuff happens in the middle. But that stuff happening in the middle is the hard part of writing a novel. So a friend, Corey McCarthy, who is also a primarily young adult author, he taught me this method of plotting. And so most of them I would look at methods and my brain would cross because I'm a visual person. I'm not a math oriented charting person. And so it took 2 years for him to talk me into it. And now I don't know how I did it before. So
Oh,
I plan out the whole thing, and a lot of it is just made up and shoved in there, like in the middle. But then it sort of evolves, and it helps me to know, what's next, and very often things take different course for a little while, and then you go back. So I plan it, but I also leave space for surprises and for going
hmm.
in different directions.
So there's also another term too that I learned from other authors, that there's also the plancer. Do you know the plancer?
It's a combo.
Kind of. So what do you use? You plant seeds as you're writing, and then when you get stuck in something, you're like, "Oh, that thing I mentioned about that pink suitcase I was left in the hallway closet." And so people would able bring stuff in. So there's the other term, which is also the plancer, which is kind of in between a plotter and a pantser in a way.
And my editors point those out. I
Oh,
actually
really?
don't even see them. They're like, they make a suggestion. I go, "Oh, that's a really good suggestion." They said, "Ann, it's already there. Look at this." And I'm like, "Oh." So thank God for editors, because, and I'm very much, a crappy first draft person. I have to force myself. I'm working on one now. I have to force myself to button share, because the art of writing to me is in the revision. And so the second, third drafts are just fun.
Hmm.
But my friend Will Alexander always says you're making the material with which you then make the art when you write a first draft. So it's just something you have to get through.
Right. Now, have you seen anything with your editors? Because editors are so important for authors. Have you been? Has there something that your editor just says this doesn't work in this book, and you got to cut out this altogether? Have you been stubborn enough to say, well, then I'm just going to put in a different book because I like this scene or I like this character development? Have you taken anything out of one book and used it for
Oh
inspiration
yeah.
in another one?
Oh, definitely. It, I never waste anything. I always tell people when they're like, "Well, my this book didn't sell, so I figure I should work on it." I said, "Yeah, you work on the next one, and that book either you pull in the characters or elements, or you revise it and send it out again, or it's nothing's wasted." And this is why I have these big discussions about the concept of failing as an artist. I don't think you fail. I think everything is process. Um, and so those drafts or those scenes you hate to get rid of, I save them.
Mm.
And I have reused them, not all the time.
Right.
Usually they're right, you know. Usually, and with hindsight, I'm like, "Oh wow, okay, that was a different book." Um, but I haven't had many hills I've had to die on where I say, no.
Right.
Um, More in covers than
Right.
anything. But um, in terms of content, I'm usually, I'm very open to feedback. Oh my God, please help me make it better. You know?
Was that something that you learned to do as an author, is to take in the feedback, or have you always been someone who just openly accepted
Oh no,
feedback from editors?
no. Um, that was MFA. That was, here you are, you're paying for this degree, you're doing all this work. If you're not listening to your advisor, because it's a non-traditional format. You send these packets, and then the idea is it emulates the edit letter. So every month you get these edit letters, and you have to process the feedback and then find a way to make it happen or not. um, and so it trained me how to do an editorial letter. So at this point, nothing shocks me. um,
Mm.
IP is a little more complicated. IP is when you are hired to write something, um, and it's their concept, so you don't have the ultimate say. um, and that's a little bit of a different animal, because you're like, "Oh wow, I never would have written that, but it isn't my call." um, that's a little bit more complicated, but if it's your book, they'll generally listen to you.
It seems like you're writing a book every other year. It feels like
Every year.
every year now.
Every year I've had a book come out since 19.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, And was because you did mention like that, but your book during COVID, was your COVID book, was that lockdown, or was that, or would you say it was actually the category 5?
It was category 5. Lockdown. I've had the privilege of being in a handful of anthologies,
Okay.
and in fact, I Combat Monsters. I just got the copy of that. The fact that I'm in this book, it's alternate stories of World War II. I'm like, Henry, I anything about World War II, but it was so exciting to do it, and I had experts who could sort of look at it. And but being in anthologies is great. But in terms of my books, it was category 5.
Okay.
It was the sequel to Five Midnights, which was my first book, solo book.
Hmm.
And I had copy edits when I was working on Five Midnights. I was working on copy edits, and Hurricane Maria happened in Puerto Rico. And so, I for like 5 days, I didn't know whether any of my family was alive. I mean, it was just awful,
Right.
and it can't compare to what they went through here. But there was all of us, on the mainland, going, "What is going on? Is my family alive?" Anyway, so I wanted to make the second book in that duology, post Maria, and so that sort of determined that. But it was so interesting because that book about post Maria came out during the height of the pandemic. Um,
Right.
so it's one crisis to another, but it was an interesting experience to launch it. But I had the privilege of my friend Luis Guzman help me launch it on Instagram, and we had a ball.
How does your Puerto Rican heritage influence your storytelling?
Oh, it's where it all came from. I mean, I started writing The Storyteller's Death, which was my first adult book, um, uh, 17 years before it came out. And so it's been 19 years now. And that was my master's thesis in Vermont College of Fine Arts. And it was all about capturing the stories of my Puerto Rican family, that I had this sort of realization that with all the old women who died, particularly the women, all the stories that died with them, really, I thought about how much I'd lost. And so uh, I started writing them down, and that's where it started. So I was sitting at a cafe in Montpelier at Capitol grounds, and I
Hmm.
said to a friend, we were talking about how old people are treated in this country, and I said, that's not true in my family. When I was in Puerto Rico, there was always some old woman dying in the back room of my childhood, and my friend's like, that's a first line. That's the first line. And so I started what I thought was a short story, and it became Storyteller's Death. But it was all about those stories of my Puerto Rican family that I worried would die with me because I wanted my son to know them. So Storyteller's Death started about wanting to tell my son the stories of Puerto Rico and why I have such a strong relationship with that side of myself.
Mm.
So, and it feeds into everything. I mean, I always like to have a Puerto Rican character because it's a small island, but it's very rich in the arts, and I want to sort of help bring attention to that. I mean, there's incredible writers down there that aren't translated, and so there's always going to be some element. And I also, well, he's up there too, but I did my only middle grade so far is a biography of Bad Bunny, who is the #1 streaming artist in the world. I'm very proud of that. But so there's always elements in my work.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. And is there, because you do mention like the magical realism and also horror, is there some sort of, I wouldn't say narrative overlap, but from like a reader's perspective, some sort of like overlap of like emotion or imagination that those two genres have?
Okay, I love that question. I love that question. Yes, because I mean, there's always an element of magic, other than the Bad Bunny book, obviously, that's a bio, but there's always an element of magic in everything I write because I'm not interested in writing something without it. And when somebody asked me why, I had to articulate that, in the Caribbean, magic is in the air, man. It's the air's heavy with it. When you tell somebody in Puerto Rico you believe in ghosts, they're like, seguro. My grandmother was on the foot of my bed this morning sitting there. You tell somebody in Vermont you believe in ghosts and they think you're off your meds. And so it's like, it is an accepted part. That's how I was raised. My mother, you tell me there's a mothership over Morrisville right now, I'd say, oh, thank God. They've come to take me. Um, and I wouldn't disbelieve it. So I don't disbelieve anything out of the gate. And so I like the idea of the possibility of magic. I believe in the possibility of supernatural. It's just stuff we don't understand. So it really has, it's always been part of my upbringing.
Hmm.
And I like it. I like magic.
Was there anything like in any of your protagonists in your stories, maybe more of your young adult novels? Did your characters go in a different direction that you weren't planning, and you just had to you basically watched your own book unfold on itself?
That happens pretty much every time. Um, you start with your pieces of yourself, like parts of my story are in all of these books. So you start with these pieces of yourself, and then they get their own personality. And so people will say, "Oh, We Need No Wings" is very much about who I am now. Storyteller's Death was more about who I was as a child in Puerto Rico every summer, but We Need No Wings is more about who I am now. So people think, "Oh, well, I saw so much of you in the main character." I'm like, "Well, it started that way." And but then she has my favorite character is a nun cousin who she meets in Spain, and she's very irreverent and funny and sharp, and I see parts of myself in her. So it's like I'm sort of pieced out through these characters, but the characters are really their own people,
Okay.
being. I don't think I'd ever want to write a memoir because why? I've already taken all the pieces that I want to tell. Not yet. It's coming though. I have a punk rock Miss Marple book that I'm working on now, which because I've always wanted to write about the punk rock time of my life in New York City, and that's the one big piece I have yet to tell.
You know bookstores really well, you know libraries really well. How do you connect with your readers, and what kind of feedback or interaction has been the most meaningful to you with your readers?
Oh boy, that's a good question too. I mean, social media, we're all having a complicated relationship with it right now, and I'm no exception. But it is really helpful for talking about books. And so that is probably the biggest piece. I go, they don't put you don't do much road trips like we used to, because it doesn't, the publisher doesn't feel it pays off quite as much. So I do more of that for my adult, and I do go on tour. I love seeing people in person, but it isn't always possible. And you can reach wider with social media. I still struggle with book talk. It is not. I recognize its power, but that power is from readers, not writers, and so I'm not too worried. I'm not as worried about what I'm producing as a Gen X boomer person.
Hmm.
So I respect it all, and I love that people use it to promote books. So social media has been important, um, and I work in a part time a bookseller in Stowe, Vermont at Bear Pond, and I have to tell you that has been probably the most exciting because um, they come in the store and they're very kind to me. They have Vermont authors with Joseph Citro, who we were just talking about, and people are drawn to it, and then they come to the counter and I was like, oh, I'm honored, and they're like, oh my God, is that you? And so that kind of reaction is or interaction is fun, and to see what else they're reading. And I think I've learned more about the business of publishing book from being a bookseller than I have from being an author,
Huh.
which I didn't anticipate. So, but I love any interaction with readers. I'm always like shocked and honored that people read my books, because it's like you sit in yourself in your little office and you type away, and you don't, the fact that you're, putting your heart on a page and then sending it to strangers is weird. So
Mm.
when they like are touched by it, or even when they hate it, if they take the time to post it about it, it's like, wow, you know, I reached them in some way. So it's magic to me.
Right.
All of that matters. So I love to hear from them. Would I like more interaction with them? Yeah. But again, I haven't found the balance for how to really capitalize on that in terms of social media.
For what advice would you give an aspiring writer who is just starting out and has hopes to publish a book?
Well, I mean, there's three very important things. The first one is to read everything you can get your hands on. If you're not writing, you should be reading. And so I still make a point of an hour a day sitting. At this point, I read either for blurbs, when the other authors ask me to sort of blurb their book, or research for what I'm working on. It's I don't get enough time to sort of read the things I'm just for fun that I'm interested in. Not that the others aren't fun, but it's just you read it in a different way. Um,
Mm.
so you should be reading continuously. You should know what's out there. And there are people who say, well, I don't want them to interfere with their voice, to interfere with mine. And I don't buy that. I think you need to know what resonates with people, what doesn't. And you should be continuously consuming. Um,
Mm.
so there's that, and audio, if you have to, it counts. I don't care what anybody says. Um, to listen to feedback, community is very important. I hang out with writers all the time. Um, and we help each other, and I wouldn't be a published author without my writer friends.
Mm.
I had sent out Storyteller's Death. I had an agent, and we were on submission, and then the last note came through, and I told my friend Mary Cronin, who's a picture book writer and a poet. I said, you've been great, you've been so supportive, but I think I'm done. And she's like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And she said, look, take a break. You clearly need a break, but no. And she was another graduate, and so she would check in every week or so. She'd say, hey, how are you doing? Finally, she said, Ann, I've been thinking about that horror story you read at the alumni retreat about El Cuco. Why don't you? I went back to that. She wore me down, and that's sold. That was Five Midnights. That was my first published book. So you need people to say, maybe that's not the first book you're going to publish. Maybe that one is. Or, you might want to look at this section that doesn't necessarily fit with the rest. And you listen to them, especially when you hear patterns. If you're in a writer's group and you hear the same thing coming out of three different people's mouths, you have to listen to it. And then the third is to never give up. I believe that 95% of writers don't succeed because they give up. And I almost did it. I just told you one of the stories. Several times I almost bagged it. And I'm stubborn, and I have friends who won't let me do it. And I had a friend say to me, Sharon Darrow, who's a North Country writer, she said to me, I said, if this one doesn't sell, I might. She goes, you're gonna what? You're gonna quit writing? She says, it's like herpes. You never get rid of that. And I'm like, and she's this polite Southern woman, and I was like, but it's sort of true. It's like, it's always who you are. And so you just have to keep going and going and going. And you really have to not give up, and
Right.
be willing to try again, and be willing to get knocked down again. Because rejection is just part of the game.
So my other question for you too is that AI is all over the place right now, and it's just going to get louder and louder. What is your impression as a published author? What are your either fears or excitements about what's going to be happening in the next few years for authors?
I'm terrified. I feel like, Storyteller's Death was stolen for an AI, fed into AI, and the legal of my publisher to get involved, and it terrifies me. When I did the research for Bad Money, he's a very private guy. There were no books at the time, and I would find these articles that were clearly written by AI. I got very good at identifying them, and half the information was wrong because I know the story of his life. I knew the basics, and they would be talking about his sons. I'm like, he doesn't have any sons. And so I worry for students who are using this for research and getting wrong information. So there's that. I also feel that art is about emotion, and a computer can't have emotions. And so I feel like we lose a lot in that translation. If we don't have art as humans, I'm not sure what's left.
Right.
And yes, I'm biased because I make my living that way, but it can't. But I was on a panel, Barney, with these people about AI because of the incident of mine being stolen. And there was a young man who was a lawyer, young man, who was probably 40, who was a lawyer for an AI company, and he fought for the companies. These were really top people in their fields. There was somebody who owned an AI company. And I told him, I said, it's about emotion. You can't have AI can't write a impactful poem about losing a child. And so I was talking, and then he said, Ann, I got to tell you, while you were speaking, I asked AI to write a poem about losing a child, a father losing a child. And he read the poem, and it was quite good. And I was like, okay, shit, there goes that argument, But it doesn't have the resonance when somebody who's writing this has had personal experience with it, and you feel this camaraderie with them, and like they get it. The AI can't get it, so it's complicated. I also, he is the one who told me, he said, it's not going to be writing novels anytime soon because there is a maximum number of pages it can retain this, it can manage the story. So I don't know. I mean, I worry because it's one of the few truly human things we do.
If people want to learn more about you and your work, where's the best place they could go to?
I mean, there's my website, probably AnnCardinal.com. Probably I'm most active on Instagram. There's a lot of people leaving it these days, but I like communicating with photographs. I've always, and so I'm there. So those are probably the best, most active places. And I love interaction on social media.
Right.
Well, non-troll interaction.
So this is great, Ann. So this is a fantastic conversation. I appreciate your time to sit down and talk with us. You got to come back on when you have another book coming out. You have one every year, so we should just always allocate the first February to have Ann come on. See,
I would love that. Yeah, I'm excited about this one. It comes out like 4 days after the Horror Writers Association conference. It's called StokerCon, and it's in Connecticut, so I can drive there. I'm so excited. So I get to be with all my horror geeks. Have a good time.
Right. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ann.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
That's awesome. All right. Let me get the intro in. And Davila.
Yeah.
Davila. Okay. All right.
Great.
All right. I think I got it. All right. I will get the intro in, and then we'll jump right in it. Davila.
Just think about it. Like the DA is really big.
Okay. Yeah. Davila. Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Davila. Okay. All right. Here we go.